But there they sat, all bound. For when they had brought them on shore they bound their hands, that they might not take the boat and make their escape. There, I say, they sat, all of them stark naked. First there were 3 comely fellows, well shaped, with straight limbs, about 30 to 35 years of age, and 5 women, whereof 2 might be from 30 to 40, 2 more about 4 or 5 and 20, and the 5th, a tall comely maiden, about 17. The women were well favoured, agreeable persons, both in shape and features, only tawny; and 2 of them, had they been perfect white, would have passed for very handsome women, even in London, having pleasant countenances, and of a very modest behaviour; especially when they came afterwards to be clothed and dressed, though that dress was very indifferent, it must be confessed. The sight, you may be sure, was something uncouth to our Spaniards, who were, to give them a just character, men of the most calm, sedate tempers, and perfect good humour, that ever I met with, and, in particular, of the utmost modesty. I say the sight was very uncouth, to see 3 naked men and 5 naked women, all together bound, and in the most miserable circumstances that human nature could be supposed to be, viz., to be expecting every moment to be dragged out and have their brains knocked out, and then to be eaten up like a calf that is killed for a dainty. The first thing they did was to cause the old Indian, Friday's father, to go in, and see first if he knew any of them, and then if he understood any of their speech. As soon as the old man came in, he looked seriously at them, but knew none of them, neither could any of them understand a word he said, or a sign he could make, except one of the women. However, this was enough to answer the end, which was to satisfy them that the men into whose hands they were fallen were Christians, that they abhorred eating men or women, and that they might be sure they would not be killed. As soon as they were assured of this, they discovered such a joy, and by such awkward gestures several ways, as is hard to describe, for it seems they were of several nations. The woman who was their interpreter was bid, in the next place, to ask them if they were willing to be servants, and to work for the men who had brought them away, to save their lives; at which they all fell a dancing, and presently one fell to taking up this, and another that, anything that lay next to carry on their shoulders, to intimate they were willing to work. The governor, who found that the having women among them would presently be attended with some inconvenience, and might occasion some strife, and perhaps blood, asked the 3 men what they intended to do with these women, and how they intended to use them, whether as servants or as wives. One of the Englishmen answered, very boldly and readily, that they would use them as both; to which the governor said, "I am not going to restrain you from it. You are your own masters as to that; but this I think is but just, for avoiding disorders and quarrels among you, and I desire it of you for that reason only, viz., that you will all engage, that if any of you take any of these women as a wife, he shall take but one; and that having taken one, none else shall touch her. For though we cannot marry any one of you, yet it is but reasonable that, while you stay here, the woman any of you takes shall be maintained by the man that takes her, and should be his wife. I mean," says he, "while he continues here, and that none else shall have anything to do with her." All this appeared so just, that every one agreed to it without any difficulty. Then the Englishmen asked the Spaniards if they designed to take any of them, but every one of them answered no. Some of them said they had wives in Spain, and the others did not like women that were not Christians, and altogether declared that they would not touch one of them, which was an instance of such virtue as I have not met with in all my travels. On the other hand, the 5 Englishmen took them every one a wife, that is to say, a temporary wife; and so they set up a new form of living, for the Spaniards and Friday's father lived in my old habitation, which they had enlarged exceedingly within. The 3 servants which were taken in the last battle of the savages lived with them, and these carried on the main part of the colony, supplied all the rest with food, and assisted them in anything as they could, or as they found necessity required. But the wonder of the story was, how 5 such refractory, ill-matched fellows should agree about these women, and that some 2 of them should not choose the same woman, especially seeing 2 or 3 of them were, without comparison, more agreeable than the others. but they took a good way enough to prevent quarrelling among themselves, for they set the 5 women by themselves in one of their huts, and they went all into the other hut, and drew lots among them who should choose first. Him that drew to choose first went away by himself to the hut where the poor naked creatures were, and fetched out her he chose; and it was worth observing, that he that chose first took her that was reckoned the homeliest and oldest of the 5, which made mirth enough amongst the rest, and even the Spaniards laughed at it; but the fellow considered, better than any of them, that it was application and business that they were to expect assistance in, as much as in anything else, and she proved the best wife of all the parcel. When the poor women saw themselves set in a row thus, and fetched out one by one, the terrors of their condition returned upon them again, and they firmly believed they were now going to be devoured. Accordingly, when the English sailor came in and fetched out one of them, the rest set up a most lamentable cry, and hung about her, and took their leave of her with such agonies and affection as would have grieved the hardest heart in the world. Nor was it possible for the Englishmen to satisfy them that they were not to be immediately murdered, till they fetched the old man, Friday's father, who immediately let them know that the 5 men, who were to fetch them out one by one, had chosen them for their wives. When they had done, and the fright the women were in was a little over, the men went to work, and the Spaniards came and helped them. In a few hours they had built them every one a new hut or tent for their lodging apart; for those they had already were crowded with their tools, household stuff, and provisions. The 3 wicked ones had pitched farthest off, and the 2 honest ones nearer, but both on the north shore of the island, so that they continued separated as before, and thus my island was peopled in 3 places, and, as I might say, 3 towns were begun to be built. And here it is very well worth observing that, as it often happens in the world, what the wise ends in God's providence are, in such a disposition of things I cannot say. The 2 honest fellows had the 2 worst wives, and the 3 reprobates, that were scarce worth hanging, that were fit for nothing, and neither seemed born to do themselves good nor any one else, had 3 clever, careful, and ingenious wives. Not that the first 2 were bad wives as to their temper or humour, for all the 5 were most willing, quiet, passive, and subjected creatures, rather like slaves than wives; but my meaning is, they were not alike capable, ingenious, or industrious, or alike cleanly and neat. Another observation I must make, to the honour of a diligent application on one hand, and to the disgrace of a slothful, negligent, idle temper on the other, that when I came to the place, and viewed the several improvements, plantings, and management of the several little colonies, the 2 men had so far outgone the 3, that there was no comparison. They had, indeed, both of them as much ground laid out for corn as they wanted, and the reason was, because according to my rule, nature dictated that it was to no purpose to sow more corn than they wanted; but the difference of the cultivation, of the planting, of the fences, and, indeed, of everything else, was easy to be seen at first view. The 2 men had innumerable young trees planted about their huts, so that, when you came to the place, nothing was to be seen but a wood; and though they had twice had their plantation demolished, once by their own countrymen, and once by the enemy, as shall be shown in its place, yet they had restored all again, and everything was thriving and flourishing about them. They had grapes planted in order, and managed like a vineyard, though they had themselves never seen anything of that kind; and by their good ordering their vines, their grapes were as good again as any of the others. They had also found themselves out a retreat in the thickest part of the woods, where, though there was not a natural cave, as I had found, yet they made one with incessant labour of their hands, and where, when the mischief which followed happened, they secured their wives and children so as they could never be found; they having, by sticking innumerable stakes and poles of the wood which, as I said, grew so readily, made the grove impassable, except in some places, when they climbed up to get over the outside part, and then went on by ways of their own leaving. As to the 3 reprobates, as I justly call them, though they were much civilized by their settlement compared to what they were before, and were not so quarrelsome, having not the same opportunity, yet one of the certain companions of a profligate mind never left them, and that was their idleness. It is true they planted corn and made fences, but Solomon's words were never better verified than in them, I went by the vineyard of the slothful, and it was all overgrown with thorns. For when